What's the most bizarre coincidence you've ever experienced? A few years ago, I was on a flight to New York, sitting next to an older man who looked strangely familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen him before. We made small talk for a while, and eventually I asked him if he had ever been to Chicago, since I felt like I recognized him from somewhere. He smiled and said, "Oh yeah, I lived there for a few years a long time ago, back when I was in my 20s." That's when things got weird. He mentioned the exact neighborhood I grew up in, the same street, even the same apartment building I lived in as a kid. I laughed and said, "No way I grew up in that building. What a small world." Then he got this look in his eyes, like something had just clicked. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through some old pictures, and showed me a faded Polaroid. It was my childhood apartment door. My apartment. I felt my stomach drop and asked him why he had a picture of my old home. He chuckled and said, "Because that was my apartment. I lived there for years before moving out of state." That's when it hit me. I was sitting next to the guy who lived in my home before my family ever moved in. And it gets even crazier. He asked me which room was mine growing up, and when I told him, he shook his head and said, "That used to be my room too." Out of all the flights in the world, out of all the seats in the plane, I ended up next to the man who had lived in my childhood home years before I was even born. What are the odds of that happening?